Welcome to today's Explainer, everyone. I'm absolutely thrilled to be your guide today. If you've ever found yourself just fascinated by how words, ideas, and entire cultural paradigms manage to cross borders, well, you are definitely in the right place. Today, we're going to put on our linguistics professor hats and unpack the incredible and honestly sometimes mind-bending complexities of meaning transfer across languages. We're looking at 65 foundations of translation and interpretation theory. So I want to kick things off by asking you a quick question. When you think about translation, do you just kind of imagine it as a simple one-to-one word swap? Like, I don't know, swapping out a blue Lego brick for a red one of the exact same size? It's a super common assumption. But is perfect translation actually impossible? I really want us to challenge that assumption today. What if the very concept of a flawless, perfectly parallel translation is just completely unattainable? Here is our syllabus for today's explainer. First, the myth of perfect translation. 2, the impossibility argument. 3, real-world translation losses. 4, Crystal's translation typology. And 5, purpose over perfection. All right, let's jump in. Section 1, the myth of perfect translation. Okay, let's dive into this. Let's start by looking at how translation has traditionally been, well, idealized. For a really long time, the public expectation was basically that a translator should act as a perfect mirror. And this ideal is captured perfectly by the widely accepted functionalist perspective of scholar Peter Newmark. He defines translation as the rendering of meaning from a source language text into a target language precisely in the way the author intended. Now, that sounds beautiful, right? The translator acts as this invisible conduit, perfectly mirroring the original author's intent so that a reader in English experiences the literal exact same text as a reader in Japanese or Spanish. It is this incredibly noble, highly theoretical goal. Which brings us to Section 2, the impossibility argument. But here is where we really need to introduce the big twist of our lecture today. What if that whole ideal of perfectly mirroring the author is actually a trap? Enter scholar George Moonen, who stated, "No translation can provide a translation that is perfectly parallel to the source language text in all respects." Essentially, Moonen is telling us that a perfect translation is a linguistic chimera. It's a myth. Why? Well, because languages are what we call non-isomorphic systems. They just don't map onto each other perfectly. They have totally different grammatical structures, entirely different cultural allusions, and different sound symbolisms. You literally can't just swap the Lego bricks, because the bricks themselves are fundamentally different shapes. And because these language systems just don't perfectly align, some loss of information is literally inevitable. In fact, our sources note that even just paraphrasing within a single language results in information loss. No way, right? So this means the translator is perpetually trapped in a pretty intense dilemma of competing priorities. Do you prioritize the individual style of the original author, or do you focus on conventional grammar in the target language? Do you prioritize cultural specificities or the expectations of your new readers? You simply cannot have them all. And this brilliantly illustrates the translator's daily struggle. Let's take a very basic phrase in Spanish, hace frío. A translator has to make a choice here. Do they translate it to the literal standard English equivalent, it is cold? Or do they interpret the pragmatic context and translate it to, I'm freezing? Even in a tiny, simple two-word phrase, the translator is forced to make a judgment call, sacrificing one specific nuance to preserve another. There's honestly no absolute best translation here. Moving on to Section 3, real-world translation losses. Now, a debate over cold versus freezing might seem purely academic, but what happens when these unavoidable translation losses actually occur on a global stage? To anchor the sheer gravity of this, we really have to look at the Japanese telegram sent to Washington just before the bombing of Hiroshima. According to the historical accounts in our sources, the Japanese word mokasuto was allegedly mistranslated in this absolutely critical communication. It was reportedly translated into English as ignored, rather than the significantly more nuanced considered. Just think about that for a second. One non-isomorphic word, one translator's forced choice, potentially altering the entire course of world history. This isn't just some classroom theory. Translation loss has very real, very massive consequences. But okay, let's take a deep breath here. While perfect equivalence is absolutely impossible, and yeah, the flaws can be highly consequential, we also have to recognize that translation is the greatest engine of cultural transmission we have. I mean, despite its imperfections, look at what it's actually achieved. The Romans effectively absorbed, or you might say pillaged, Greek culture through translation. The famous Toledo School transferred vital Arabic and Greek scientific learning straight into Europe. And in the 19th century, German culture completely absorbed the works of Shakespeare. Translation has consistently democratized information and accelerated human development across eras.
Section 4. Crystal's Translation Typology.
So, if perfect translation is impossible, but the act of translation is still so incredibly vital to human progress, how do professionals actually resolve this paradox? Well, the solution is translating with a very specific purpose. First up, David Crystal gives us pragmatic translation. Here, the translator acts almost like a rigorous scientist. The absolute primary focus is accuracy, precise information transfer, and deep subject knowledge. I mean, if you're translating a medical instruction manual or some complex scientific research paper, you don't care if the prose sounds poetic, right? You care that the dosage instructions are 100% scientifically accurate in the target language. That is absolutely crucial. But what if you were translating poetry or a deeply moving novel? Well, that requires Crystal's second category, aesthetic translation. This requires a much more delicate, contemplative approach. The translator is trying to preserve the emotional and cognitive content while maintaining stylistic equivalence. It's like a giant puzzle. It is an incredibly difficult balancing act between precise meaning and creative, artistic expression. Then we have the third category, which is ethnographic translation. This focuses heavily on the cultural backgrounds of both the author and the recipient, and this is vital when dealing with culturally specific concepts, sensitive materials, or deep cultural idioms that just have no direct equivalent in the target culture. For example, translating the Spanish phrase buen provecho, which is said before a meal, really requires understanding the sociocultural differences between the communities, mostly because English lacks a direct, widely used equivalent beyond perhaps the borrowed bon appetit. So the crucial point we're seeing in this table is this. Because translators literally cannot provide a perfectly parallel text, they must choose their priority based on the text's purpose. Are they prioritizing accuracy for a medical manual using pragmatic translation? Are they prioritizing emotion for a poem using aesthetic? Or are they prioritizing cultural context for a culturally specific concept using ethnographic? The impossibility of perfection is ultimately solved by the clarity of purpose. Which brings us to our conclusion. Section 5. Purpose over perfection. The next time you think about translation, I really want you to discard the idea of a perfect, lossless mirror. Successful translation is not about achieving some impossible linguistic ideal. It's about fulfilling a specific purpose for a specific audience. So I want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought. Next time you read a translated novel, watch a dubbed movie, or even just assemble furniture using a translated manual, ask yourself, what was the translator forced to leave behind so that you could understand it? What invisible choices were made? Keep that in mind, and for sure you'll experience global media in a completely new, profoundly richer way. Thank you so much for joining me for today's explainer, and keep exploring the incredible world of language.